I'm now going to have a look at how a camera works, because knowing about the main parts of the camera can help us understand the main camera controls at our disposal. I'm also going to introduce the concept of light cones. Now these depict on how light behaves on its way from the subject through the lens onto the camera sensor. Now this isn't a new idea, but I use these drawings to form mental pictures to help understand the way light behaves when interacting with our lenses and cameras and their associated controls. I'll be starting off with very simply, and then developing the ideas as we explore the various parts of the camera and how it works. So please try and understand the ideas I'm trying to impart at the beginning, as these are fundamental to the way it'll be expanded on as we get to grips with lenses, focal length, aperture and shutter speed. I'm going to start by explaining the most simple of cameras, the pinhole camera, and have a look at the problems we have with such a design, and from there we can more appreciate why we have the components and the controls we see in the more modern cameras. So let's have a look. We'll try and construct one from basic principles. Here we have the pinhole camera. So basically it's a light tight box, a box where no light can get in at present, and at one side of the box we have a sensor. In this case it's going to be a digital sensor because it's a very modern pinhole camera. Outside the box we have a nice scene that we want to take a photograph of, and of course it's illuminated by a light source, in this case the sun. Now in order for any light to get through onto the sensor we need a hole, and the hole is what we call an aperture. So you can imagine various parts of the scene, so the top of that tree there, particles of light travel from there through the hole and form an impression on the sensor there, the top of the tree. We have flowers down here and they are doing the same thing, giving off light from the sun, reflected off the sun, reflected from off the flowers through the hole, and we can trace these rays of light and we can get an appreciation as to why it forms an inverted and back-to-back image on the sensor. But from this we can see how the rays of light actually produce an image. This is with a pinhole camera, no lenses involved. So the rays of light from each part of the scene create a kind of fuzzy rendering. It's not all that sharp, this. So to control the light hitting the sensor here, we can introduce what we call a shutter. Okay, so here's our shutter, and when we activate the shutter it stops the light coming into the camera and we cease to expose the sensor. So when it opens, the shutter opens to let light onto the sensor, we call that the exposure. The sensor is exposed to light. Different exposure times, which we call shutter speed, will let in more or less light onto the sensor, and that will affect what's called the exposure, the brightness of the light hitting the sensor. Now normally the shutter remains closed apart from the time that we actually expose for the image. Now the sharpness of this projected image onto the sensor is determined by the diameter. Now we're talking about the pinhole camera here. We're not talking about a normal camera, it's a pinhole camera. So this the diameter of the aperture, the hole, determines the sharpness of a pinhole camera's image. And here I'm trying to introduce these cones of light. So from this little point here in the image, it's giving off light in all directions, all over the place. But some of those bits of light are traveling towards the camera, the hole, the aperture in the camera. Some will go from across the very top of the hole, some will go along the bottom of the hole, some through the middle, but they'll build up to produce a rendering on the sensor. And you can see that the way these rays of light are going, it's actually not going to produce a sharp image because that spot on the image or of the subject will be rendered in an area around there. So it's going to be a fuzzy sort of image. So I'm calling these the cones of light, and it's producing a rather indistinct image here. So in this illustration, we've made the hole smaller. The aperture is now smaller. And so if you imagine these cones of light, you can see that they're far closer together. So the bits going across the very top part of the hole and the bits going across the bits of light going past the very bottom of the hole, they're very close together. And there's less chance for those light rays to be spread out. So we get a much sharper image, because the aperture in this pinhole camera is a lot smaller. So the sharpness of the projected image onto the center is determined by the diameter of the pinhole camera's aperture. Although making the hole smaller produces a sharper image, the amount of light gets well, you can imagine a very, very small hole will produce a very, very dim image. Okay. Now the other thing to think about is a thing called depth of field. So the depth of field, which is the zone of acceptable sharpness in front and behind the main subject, is effectively infinite with a pinhole camera. Okay. We have no method of focusing. The light just comes from whatever subject we're looking at through the hole onto the sensor. So we can visualize this using the very narrow cones of light. The narrower the cones of light, the sharper the image. And a subject far away, a bit closer, or very close will all appear virtually the same sharpness. Not very sharp at all, because it's a pinhole camera, but they'll all appear the same kind of sharpness. So a minute hole, we're going to change it to a very, very small hole here, will produce a pin sharp image with infinite depth of field, but of course the image will be so impossibly dim as to be useless. And of course we'd also introduce other effects called diffraction, which would make this kind of camera impossible anyhow. But I'm just trying to get across the basic principles of small aperture in the pinhole camera makes increased sharpness and depth of field. Now let's have a quick look at aperture values, because we'll be using these with lenses, but we can also get a little appreciation as to what aperture is using the pinhole camera. So aperture values are measured in what's called f-stops, and you may have seen these kind of numbers, f2.8, f8, and wonder what they're all about. So what is an f-stop? So the aperture f value is a ratio, and we're normally talking about a lens here, but in this case we're going to be talking about the hole, the aperture in the pinhole camera, over the focal length over the diameter of the aperture. So it's just a straight ratio. So in this case we have a focal length, in this case it's going to be the distance between the hole and the sensor. With a normal camera it would be the lens and the sensor of 100 millimeters. So if we measure from the hole to the sensor and say that's 100 millimeters, that's our focal length. And an aperture of 10 millimeters. So if this hole was 10 millimeters wide, divide 100 by 10 and we get 10. So we say that's a f10. We've got an f10, well, I can't say lens, but an f10 camera. Okay, but we now know that if we have a really, really wide hole like that, for a pinhole camera, it will produce a really, really fuzzy image, but relatively bright. Okay. If we change the aperture value down to say half a millimeter, we can now work out 100 divided by half a millimeter equals f200. Okay, so we've got a much higher f value, but the amount of light that's getting through this tiny hole is a lot smaller. Now that understanding the higher the F number means less light getting through, whether it's a lens or a small hole, is applicable throughout all our photography. So large numbers means less light is getting through the lens. Small numbers like F1 or F2 means a lot of light is getting through the lens or the hole onto the sensor. We also know that a small hole, the aperture will produce a sharper image for a pinhole camera due to the way the light cones are hitting the sensor. So the sharpness across the whole depth of field also increases as we make the aperture smaller. So this depth of field principle applies to all cameras, including those with lenses. As F numbers increase, they get bigger, so does the depth of field. So this is really useful to remember. And we also know that as the F number increases, the amount of light getting onto the sensor reduces. So let's just have a quick recap. Aperture size is the diameter of the hole letting in the light. In this case, our pinhole camera there. Focal length is the distance between the hole, or the lens, and the camera sensor. When the lens, if it was a lens, is focused at infinity, that is. But with our pinhole camera, it makes no odds because we have infinite depth of field, effectively. The aperture f-stop is the ratio between the focal length, distance between the lens and the sensor, and the aperture diameter, the hole diameter in our case. And we get these familiar sort of numbers, f2.8, f200, etc. A shutter is used to regulate the duration, the shutter speed, that light is allowed onto the sensor. And we sometimes see this on the camera's TV, which is time value, shutter speed. Aperture is sometimes called AV, aperture value. It can only produce a relatively fuzzy, unsharp image. Smaller apertures for pinhole cameras produce sharper images, but again, that's for pinhole cameras. Depth of field is virtually infinite with a pinhole camera. The projected image onto the sensor is impossibly dim for all practical purposes. So what we really need is we need a sharp image and we need a bright image. So this is where we introduce the lens. This is why we need lenses rather than pinhole cameras. So we can now modify our pinhole camera design to include a lens. Okay, so here's our box, here's our sensor. We've now introduced a lens. An internal shutter. So instead of having the shutter at the entrance to the box here, some lenses actually have shutters built into the lenses, but most modern SLR cameras, single lens reflex cameras, interchangeable lens cameras, have the shutter in front of the sensor. Okay, so it's a series of curtains really. We also have what's called a reflex mirror. This is where digital SLR term comes from. It's a digital, as in digital sensor, single lens, one lens here, reflex, as in the mirror flips up, reflexes, single lens reflex camera, digital single lens reflex camera. That's where how the acronym comes about. And we have a viewfinder, so that most of the time the light is coming from the scene through the lens, bounces off the mirror into the viewfinder and into the eyeball of the viewer. Okay, so that is the basic makeup of a camera, a single lens reflex camera. So hopefully from that pinhole camera through to the evolution of the digital SLR, you can begin to appreciate how the camera works, and we'll be exploring the different parts of the camera in more detail in further videos.